Should the church get actively involved in social justice issues, or should the church just remain silent and safe, continue to have service, pray for people, and hope that things will change on their own? That's coming up today on The Beat. Hey, my friend, welcome back to The Beat. My name is Parr. Thank you so much for tuning in. If this is your first time here, it's a pleasure. If you want a free ebook, click the link in the description box below. If you enjoy this video, consider subscribing, hit that little bell notification so you won't miss a beat. So before I jump into this question, I want to make a couple of disclaimers. Number one, I'm not talking about whether the church should get involved in all social issues, but rather social justice issues. Second of all, I firmly believe that the primary role of the church is not to promote social justice, but rather to warn of divine justice. So before we answer this question, I need to explain the tension that is present because there are very strong feelings about this on both sides. Some people will say, you know what? The church needs to get actively involved. They need to be picketing. They need to be rioting. They need to be protesting and taking a stand in our community for justice. And other people say, no, the church just needs to stay in their lane and continue to do what they are doing. So typically the tension looks like this. Is it worth it for us as a church to take a hard stand on something and potentially alienate people who do not agree with us on that stand, and thus minimizing our opportunity to pour into them in terms of spiritual matters and spiritual growth, which we deem as being much more important than any social issues? Let me make it a little bit clearer. Let's say a church has to decide whether they should take a stand for, Black Lives Matter. Not the movement, but rather what that slogan represents. They would understand that if we do that, we are going to alienate ourselves from people who do not agree with this particular statement and what it represents. And if we do alienate ourselves from these people, number one, we could potentially lose them as members. Number two, we are going to lose the opportunity to pour into them in terms of their spiritual growth. But number three, we could lose their financial commitment to our church. And so in many cases, it's just easier to remain silent. But is that what the scriptures tell us to do? So in this video, I'm going to talk about three things. Number one, what is the command that God has given to all people? Number two, what are some examples of people in the Old Testament taking a stand for social justice issues? And then number three, most importantly, what did Jesus have to say about this issue of social justice? And real quick, I know this is a controversial one, but what are your thoughts? Should the church get more involved? Are you upset that maybe your church is kind of silent in this time? Let's talk about it. Leave it in the comments section below. Okay, question number one, what does God say to all people? Well, if you look at Proverbs chapter 31, verse 8, it says, "Speak up for those who cannot speak for themselves. Ensure justice for those being crushed." And so notice here, the command is for the people of God to stand up and take a stand and be a voice for people who are not in a position to be able to advocate for themselves. If you are in a position of power, influence, and authority, the mandate is to take a stand for people who are not able to stand up for themselves. And so usually churches have connections with the city government, the mayor, the law enforcement. So should they use their resources, their influence, and their power to take a stand for people who are not able to stand for themselves in this issue of social justice? I'm going to answer that a little bit later on in this video. And so the second question we want to look at today is, what are some examples in the Old Testament of prophets who took a stand against the social justice issues of that day? Well, there are several examples, but the first one I want to share with you comes from 1 Kings chapter 21. And there's a great story. If you have a time later, you want to read it on your own. I don't have time to go through the whole thing, but there was this guy whose name was Naboth, and he had a piece of land, a vineyard, that was in close proximity to the king's palace. And so the king at that time, whose name was Ahab, he goes to Naboth and he says, "Hey man, I would love to pay you for your vineyard because I would love to use it as a vegetable garden." And so Naboth says, "Nah, man, I think I want to hold on to this because this is the only land I got and this is my inheritance that I can pass on to my kids. And so thanks, but no thanks." And so Ahab goes back home to his wife Jezebel and tells her everything that happened. And Jezebel says, "Oh, aren't you the king? So if you're the king, that means you could take it by force. But since you're so weak and you can't do it, then I'm going to stand up and I'm going to do what you are too weak to do. And so basically Jezebel goes and seizes this man's land by force and has him murdered. Now, the point of the story is not so much what she did, but rather later on in the story, God calls a man named Elijah to challenge Ahab and Jezebel against this murder that was happening in the kingdom at that time. Now, the point of this story has nothing to do with Jezebel, but rather it's the fact that God called Elijah to stand up and take a stand and speak out against the murder of this innocent man named Naboth. But not only did the prophets of the Old Testament verbally and actively speak out against social justice issues such as murder, but they also spoke out about corrupt judicial system. Another prophet named Amos says this in chapter 5, verse 7, "You twist justice, making it a bitter pill for the oppressed. You treat the righteous like dirt." So he's talking here about a system in the Old Testament that was perverted and twisted and corrupt and favored people who were in power rather than people who were destitute and unable to stand up for themselves. Notice he continues and says, "For I know the vast number of your sins. You deprive the poor of" what? "Justice in the courts." Now, the overall message that God wanted to send to the people at that time is found in verses 21 through 24. It says, "I hate all your show and pretense, the hypocrisy of your religious festivals and solemn assemblies." Now, that is some very strong language that God is saying. He's saying, look, basically, I hate church. I hate your church. I hate your worship. I hate your festivals. I hate all your celebrations. I hate your music. I hate all these things because it is done in the name of hypocrisy. How can you worship me, a God that is all about justice, when you are not carrying out justice and standing against the injustices that are all around you? Let's keep going. He says, "I will not accept your burnt offerings and grain offerings. I won't even notice all your choice peace offerings. Away with your noisy hymns of praise. I will not listen to the music of your harps. Instead, I want to see a mighty flood of justice, an endless river of righteous living." I believe the message that God is trying to say through the prophet of Amos is that, hey, what good is it for us to be a religious system that talks about all these things and promotes a God of justice, and yet we ourselves are not doing anything to stand for justice and stand against injustice? But now the third thing that we want to look at is, what did Jesus have to say about this issue of justice? Well, notice here in Luke 4:18, Jesus tells us exactly why he came. It says here, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, for he has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim that captives will be released, that the blind will see, that the oppressed will be set free." So notice here, the primary reason why Jesus came, as he states at the beginning, is to proclaim the good news. That is the very first thing that he is come to do. That's his primary role. But there is no denying that as you read some of these other things, like setting the captives free and setting the oppressed free and taking a stand for these people, that there are some issues of social justice that Jesus came to rectify in the culture in which he lived. Now, elsewhere in Matthew 23, verse 23, he says this, "What sorrow awaits you, teachers of religious law, and you Pharisees." Once again, we see the same word that was found in Amos. "Hypocrites, for you are careful to tithe even the tiniest income from your herb gardens, but you ignore the more important aspects of the law." And what's the first one that he mentions? Justice, mercy, and faith. You should tithe, yes, but do not neglect the more important things. Now, this is strong once again, because Jesus is essentially saying it's hypocritical for us to teach the law and do all of these religious activities and yet ignore what he calls, I didn't say it, what he calls are the more important or the weightier matters of the law. Once again, the first thing he mentions is justice. Now, I don't know about you, but I don't see too many examples in the Bible where there are injustices going on and the people of God were told to remain silent and not do anything in fear of losing support from other people. I just don't see that in the scriptures. Now, with that being said, does this mean that the church, or Christians for that matter, should get involved in every single social issue that comes up? I don't necessarily believe that. But what I do believe is that churches, church leaders, and individual Christians should prayerfully seek the Lord as to which specific issues of social justice that they need to take a stand on, and make sure that their voice is being heard so that they can use their influence, power, and authority to promote some sort of social justice change and take a stand against injustice. And so, more importantly, anytime the church gets actively involved in social justice issues, we must always remember that our primary goal is to advance the kingdom rather than to simply just evoke change on earth. So once again, this is a controversial issue. I would love to hear from you. Is your church silent at this time? Do you believe churches need to get actively involved? What is your stance? Do you believe Christians should get involved in social justice issues? Leave it in the comment section below, and I'd love to talk about it. If you found this video helpful in any way, feel free to share it with a friend. Also, if you haven't done so already, I would love it if you would subscribe. Check out some of the other videos on this channel. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you next time on The Beat.